Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Tonight, we are tracking multiple flashpoints across the Middle East and South Asia, stories that, taken together, paint a picture of a region being reshaped by force, by legislation, and by backdoor diplomacy. These are stories the mainstream press will give you in 30-second clips. We're going to give you the full picture.
I'm Maya Clarity, and tonight's show is one you need to stay for, start to finish. We're covering an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon that killed at least 10 people, including a Hezbollah commander, months after a ceasefire was supposed to hold. We're covering a bill moving through the Israeli Knesset that would allow the execution of Palestinian prisoners. We're looking at a deadly attack on Pakistani soldiers and what it tells us about the forever wars nobody talks about. And we have a senior Saudi figure calling the UAE Israel's Trojan horse in the Gulf.
Plus, with talk of a potential US-Iran conflict heating up, we'll break down what that actually means on the ground. There's a thread connecting all of these stories tonight, and by the end of this broadcast, you're going to see it clearly. Let's get started.
We begin in Lebanon, where an Israeli airstrike has shattered what was left of a fragile ceasefire. According to reporting from Middle East Eye, an Israeli strike killed at least 10 people, including a Hezbollah leader. This strike hit in southern Lebanon, an area that was supposed to be stabilizing under the terms of the November 2024 ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. That agreement, brokered with heavy U.S. involvement, was meant to end the escalatory cycle that began in October 2023.
Let's be precise about what happened here. This was not a defensive operation against an imminent threat. This was a targeted assassination strike deep inside Lebanese territory that killed a Hezbollah commander along with multiple other people, civilians among them. When you kill 10 people to get one target, that's not precision warfare. That's collective punishment dressed up in military jargon. And it's a direct violation of the ceasefire framework that the international community celebrated just months ago.
And here's the part that should concern everyone watching. Under the terms of that ceasefire, both sides agreed to a cessation of hostilities, with a monitoring mechanism in place. Israel has repeatedly conducted operations in southern Lebanon since that agreement, claiming security justifications each time. But each strike erodes the ceasefire further. The question is not whether the ceasefire is under strain, it's whether it functionally exists anymore.
The timing matters too. This strike comes as Israel is simultaneously escalating in Gaza, pushing legislation domestically that we'll cover in a moment, and deepening its strategic relationships in the Gulf. When you see a country conducting military operations across multiple theaters while reshaping its domestic legal framework, you're not looking at isolated incidents. You're looking at a coordinated strategic posture.
Middle East Eye's reporting identifies the Hezbollah leader killed in this strike, and sources on the ground describe significant destruction in the surrounding area. Lebanese officials have condemned the attack. But here's what's been notably absent: any meaningful pushback from the United States or European capitals. The silence from Washington on this ceasefire violation is deafening, especially given that the U.S. positioned itself as the guarantor of this agreement.
That's the key word, guarantor. When the U.S. brokers a ceasefire and then says nothing when one party violates it, the message to the world is clear. The rules apply selectively. And that selective application of international norms is not just a Middle East problem. It's a precedent that every conflict zone on Earth is watching. If ceasefire agreements can be violated without consequence when the violator is a U.S. ally, then ceasefire agreements mean nothing.
We should also note the human cost beyond the headline number. 10 dead in a single strike. In a country that has already endured decades of war and instability, every one of those casualties has a family, a community that is now grieving and asking whether safety is even possible. The psychological toll of living under the threat of strikes that can come at any moment, ceasefire or no ceasefire, is immeasurable.
And for Hezbollah, the calculus is complicated. They face domestic pressure to respond, but a full-scale retaliation risks reigniting a war that devastated southern Lebanon. Israel knows this. These targeted strikes are designed to test limits, to see how far they can push before the other side breaks. It's a strategy of controlled escalation, and it's extraordinarily dangerous because the margin for miscalculation is razor-thin.
The broader pattern here is one of fait accompli. Strike first, set the new reality on the ground, and dare anyone to object. We've seen this playbook before, and tonight we're seeing it play out in real time. Now let's turn to a story that connects directly to this pattern of escalation: legislation moving through the Israeli Knesset that would fundamentally change the legal landscape for Palestinian detainees.
This next story should send a chill down the spine of anyone who cares about the rule of law. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, a bill is being pushed through the Knesset that would allow the execution of Palestinian prisoners. Let that sink in. A democratic legislature is actively debating whether to give the state the power to execute prisoners based on their national identity. This isn't some fringe proposal from a backbencher. This is moving through the legislative process.
Al Jazeera's analysis frames this within the broader context of international indifference, arguing that the world's failure to hold Israel accountable for its actions in Gaza and the West Bank has created the political space for this kind of legislation. And that analysis is hard to argue with. When there are no consequences for settlement expansion, no consequences for civilian casualties in military operations, no consequences for ceasefire violations, eventually the line moves to places we once thought unthinkable.
Let's talk about the legal dimensions here. Israel has not carried out a judicial execution since the case of Adolf Eichmann in 1962. The death penalty exists in Israeli military law but has essentially been dormant. Reviving it specifically for Palestinian prisoners is not a security measure. It's a political statement. It says that Palestinian lives are valued differently under Israeli law, and it codifies that distinction in the most permanent way possible.
The proponents of this bill argue it's about deterrence, that the threat of execution will discourage attacks on Israeli citizens. But every serious study of the death penalty shows it does not deter politically motivated violence. People who are willing to die for a cause are not deterred by the threat of state execution. What this bill does accomplish is something else entirely. It dehumanizes an entire population in the eyes of the law, and it gives the state an irreversible tool of violence against people in its custody.
And we need to connect this to what's happening on the ground. Israel currently holds thousands of Palestinian prisoners, many of them held under administrative detention without charge or trial. Reports from human rights organizations, including B'Tselem and Amnesty International, have documented systematic abuse of Palestinian detainees. Adding execution to that system isn't adding a deterrent. It's adding a weapon to an apparatus that already operates with minimal oversight.
The international response to this bill has been muted, which is exactly the point Al Jazeera's opinion piece makes. The argument is that years of incremental normalization, of settlement expansion, of military operations in civilian areas, of the blockade of Gaza, have exhausted the international community's capacity for outrage. Each escalation becomes the new baseline, and the next escalation is measured against that. It's a ratchet effect, and this execution bill is the latest turn of that ratchet.
What's particularly alarming is the domestic political context. This bill is gaining traction not despite the current military operations but because of them. The climate of war creates political cover for extreme legislation. Lawmakers can frame any opposition as soft on security, and in the current environment, that's politically lethal. We've seen this pattern in conflicts around the world. War becomes the justification for stripping away legal protections, and those protections rarely come back when the fighting stops.
I want to highlight something from Al Jazeera's framing that is crucial. The headline reads, "Israel wants to execute Palestinians and the world will allow it." That's not just an opinion, it's a prediction based on observable patterns. The international community has allowed every previous escalation. There is no reason, based on the current trajectory, to believe this one will be different. And that should be a wake-up call to every human rights organization, every government that claims to uphold the rules-based international order.
The through line between this story and the Lebanon strike is unmistakable. In Lebanon, Israel is using military force outside its borders with impunity. Domestically, it's reshaping its legal system to grant itself more extreme powers over Palestinian lives. These are not separate stories. They are two faces of the same coin, a state that is testing the limits of what the international community will tolerate, and finding, time and again, that those limits don't exist in practice.
Now we shift to the Gulf, where the geopolitical fault lines are just as sharp but far less visible. A senior Saudi figure has made an extraordinary statement on the David Hearst Podcast, as reported by Middle East Eye. The claim is direct and unambiguous. The UAE is, in this person's words, Israel's Trojan horse in the Gulf region. That is a remarkable accusation from within the Saudi establishment, and it signals deep fractures in what has been publicly presented as Gulf unity.
To understand the weight of this statement, you have to understand the history. The UAE signed the Abraham Accords with Israel in 2020, normalizing relations and opening diplomatic, economic, and security ties. Saudi Arabia did not sign on, though there has been persistent speculation about a future Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. The Saudi position has publicly remained tied to the Palestinian issue, no normalization without progress toward Palestinian statehood. But this statement goes much further than disagreement over normalization.
Calling the UAE a Trojan horse is not diplomatic language. It's an accusation of strategic betrayal, the suggestion that the UAE's relationship with Israel is not just about bilateral ties but about advancing Israeli influence and interests within the Gulf at the expense of broader Arab and Muslim solidarity. And when a senior Saudi figure makes this claim publicly, it's not a slip of the tongue. This is a message being sent deliberately through a media channel.
The David Hearst Podcast, hosted by the editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye, has become a platform where these kinds of statements are made. Hearst has deep contacts across the Middle East, and the guests on his podcast often include figures who are willing to say things that don't appear in official communiques. The fact that a senior Saudi figure chose this venue to make this accusation tells us that there are conversations happening behind closed doors that would shock anyone who takes Gulf cooperation at face value.
Let's think about what Trojan horse means in this context. The UAE has built extensive economic and intelligence ties with Israel since the Abraham Accords. There are reports of joint cyber surveillance programs, shared intelligence on Iran, and significant Israeli investment in UAE tech sectors. If the Saudi view is that these ties are being used to project Israeli influence into Gulf security architecture, that has enormous implications for regional alignment.
And this comes at a time when the Gulf is being asked to pick sides on multiple fronts. The war in Gaza has put enormous public pressure on Gulf governments. Populations across the Arab world are outraged by what they see in Gaza, and governments that are perceived as too close to Israel face domestic backlash. Saudi Arabia has navigated this by maintaining its public stance on Palestinian statehood. The UAE, by contrast, has been quieter, and this accusation suggests that silence is being read in Riyadh as complicity.
There's also an economic dimension. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are competitors as much as allies, competing for foreign investment, for influence in energy markets, for positioning as the future hub of the region's economy. If the UAE's relationship with Israel gives it strategic advantages that Saudi Arabia can't access without normalizing, that creates a competitive dynamic layered on top of the geopolitical one. This isn't just about solidarity with Palestinians. It's about power and influence in the Gulf.
The question this raises is whether we're seeing the beginning of a public Saudi-UAE rift on the Israel question. Historically, the Gulf states have managed their disagreements privately. The fact that this is now being stated openly, even through the proxy of a media appearance, suggests that the private channels may not be working. And if the Saudi-Emirati relationship fractures over Israel, the ripple effects across the entire region would be seismic.
Now let's turn to Pakistan, where 2 soldiers were killed during a military operation in the country's northwest. According to Al Jazeera, an explosive-laden motorcycle was rammed into a vehicle in a security forces convoy in the Bannu district of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The military also reports that 5 militants were killed in the operation. This is a story that rarely makes international headlines, but it tells us something important about the wars that grind on outside the media spotlight.
Pakistan's northwestern tribal regions have been a theater of conflict for over 2 decades, dating back to the US-led war on terror that began after September 11, 2001. The Pakistani military has conducted multiple operations in these areas, operations like Zarb-e-Azb Rad-ul-Fazad that were presented as decisive campaigns against militancy. Yet here we are in 2026, and soldiers are still dying in ambushes in Bannu. The so-called decisive operations were anything but.
Al Jazeera's reporting on this incident comes from the military's own inter-services public relations statement, which means we're getting the Pakistani military's framing of events. They describe a convoy attack using an explosive-laden motorcycle, a tactic that's been a hallmark of militant groups operating in the tribal areas for years. The fact that this tactic is still being used successfully tells us that despite massive military investment, the security forces have not been able to eliminate the threat in these regions.
And let's be honest about why this conflict persists. The roots of militancy in Pakistan's northwest are deeply intertwined with the country's own strategic choices, the decades of supporting militant groups as proxies in Afghanistan, the displacement of populations through military operations, the failure to invest in governance and development in these regions. You can't bomb your way out of a problem that was created by policy. And every soldier killed, every militant killed, every civilian caught in the crossfire is a testament to that failure.
The human toll here is staggering when you look at the cumulative numbers. Tens of thousands of Pakistani soldiers, militants, and civilians have been killed in this conflict since 2001. Millions have been displaced. And the regions most affected, the former FATA areas, now merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, remain among the least developed parts of the country. The cycle is vicious. Lack of development fuels grievances, grievances fuel recruitment into militant groups, militancy triggers military operations, and military operations further destroy development.
The Bannu district specifically has been a flashpoint for years. It borders North Waziristan, which was the epicenter of militant activity and the target of Operation Zarb-e-Azb in 2014. The fact that attacks are still occurring in Bannu suggests that militants displaced from one area simply re-establish in another. It's a game of whack-a-mole, and the Pakistani military has been playing it for 2 decades without a winning strategy.
What also doesn't get discussed enough is the regional dimension. Pakistan's northwest borders Afghanistan, And the Taliban government in Kabul has been accused of providing sanctuary to groups like the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP. The relationship between Islamabad and Kabul has deteriorated significantly over this issue. Pakistan has even conducted airstrikes inside Afghan territory, which the Taliban government has condemned. So this isn't just an internal Pakistani security issue, it's a cross-border conflict with its own escalation dynamics.
And the international community's interest in Pakistan's tribal conflicts has waned dramatically since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. When American soldiers were at risk in the region, Pakistan's counterterrorism operations got attention, funding, and diplomatic support. Now, Pakistani soldiers die in ambushes and it barely registers as a news story. The war goes on, the soldiers keep dying, and the world looks elsewhere.
That's a pattern we're seeing across every story tonight, the selective allocation of international attention. Some conflicts get wall-to-wall coverage. Others, equally deadly, equally complex, barely merit a paragraph. And that disparity in attention directly translates into a disparity in accountability. Where the cameras aren't pointed, abuses go unchecked, bad policies persist, and people die in silence.
Our final story tonight ties everything together. Consortium News reports that analyst Scott Ritter is warning about the possibility of a major US-Iran conflict. With the current tensions across the Middle East, the strikes in Lebanon, the escalation in Gaza, the Gulf rivalries we've discussed, the prospect of a wider war involving Iran, the United States, and Israel is not hypothetical. It's a scenario that military planners on all sides are actively preparing for.
Let's lay out the landscape. Iran's position in the region is defined by its network of allied groups, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and its support for Palestinian factions. The Israeli strike in Lebanon that we covered at the top of the show is not just an attack on Hezbollah. It's a strike against a key node in Iran's regional architecture. Every time Israel degrades Hezbollah's leadership, it weakens Iran's deterrent capability.
And that's precisely why the prospect of a US-Iran war is so dangerous right now. If Iran perceives that its regional deterrent, its ability to threaten Israel through allied groups, is being systematically dismantled, the pressure to respond directly increases. Iran's calculus has always been based on strategic patience and asymmetric warfare through proxies. But there's a point at which losing those proxies becomes an existential threat, and the response becomes direct and potentially catastrophic.
The U.S. role here is critical and deeply concerning. The current posture of the United States in the Middle East is one of maximum support for Israel with minimal restraint. When you combine that with the hawkish positions on Iran that have dominated U.S. foreign policy for decades, you get a situation where the U.S. could be drawn into a conflict not through a deliberate decision but through the logic of alliance commitments and escalation dynamics.
Ritter's analysis, as described by Consortium News, focuses on the rationale, conduct, and outcome of such a conflict. And let's be clear about what that outcome would look like. Iran is not Iraq or Afghanistan. It has a population of 85 million, a sophisticated military with advanced missile capabilities, and the ability to disrupt global energy supplies by threatening shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes. A war with Iran would not be a quick operation. It would be a regional catastrophe with global economic consequences.
And here's where all of tonight's stories converge. The Israeli strike in Lebanon weakens Iran's regional position. The execution bill in the Knesset further radicalizes the environment and eliminates paths to political resolution. The Saudi accusation against the UAE exposes fractures in what should be a unified Gulf response to regional instability. The ongoing conflict in Pakistan's northwest reminds us that military solutions to political problems create forever wars. And the specter of a US-Iran conflict hangs over all of it like a storm cloud that everyone can see but no one is willing to address.
This is the pattern, and I want to be explicit about it. What we are witnessing across the Middle East and South Asia is the failure of the international order to constrain the use of force. When ceasefire agreements are violated without consequence, when execution laws can be passed without international sanction, when alliances are used to project power rather than build peace, we get exactly what we're seeing tonight, a region sliding toward wider conflict while the institutions that are supposed to prevent it stand by and watch.
And the cost, as always, falls on ordinary people. The 10 killed in Lebanon strike. The Palestinian prisoners who may face execution. The Pakistani soldiers dying in ambushes in the mountains of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The millions across the region living under the shadow of a war they didn't choose and can't escape. These aren't abstractions. These are human beings, and their governments and the international community are failing them.
I want to talk about the media's role in this, because it matters. When we cover these stories in 30-second segments, when we treat each one as an isolated incident, we strip away the context that makes them intelligible. The Israeli strike in Lebanon only makes sense in the context of the broader Israeli strategy of regional dominance. The execution bill only makes sense in the context of decades of dehumanization. The Pakistan attack only makes sense in the context of 25 years of failed counterterrorism policy. If we don't connect these dots, we're not doing journalism. We're doing stenography.
And that's why shows like this one exist. Because the truth doesn't come in isolated pieces. It comes in patterns, and those patterns only become visible when you're willing to look at the whole picture. Tonight we've looked at the whole picture, and what it shows us is a region where the use of force is escalating, where legal and diplomatic constraints are eroding, and where the potential for wider conflict is growing by the day.
So what do we do with that information? First, we stay informed. We don't let any of these stories fade from our attention just because the news cycle moves on. Second, we demand accountability, from our own governments, from international institutions, from media outlets that choose what to cover and what to ignore. Third, we remember that behind every headline is a human story, and those stories deserve to be told fully and honestly.
We want to hear from you. What patterns are you seeing that we should be investigating? What stories in your region aren't getting the coverage they deserve? Truth Report exists because you, our audience, believe that journalism should be more than surface-level headlines. You believe, as we do, that understanding the connections between events is the first step toward changing the systems that produce them.
Before we go, let's recap what we covered tonight. An Israeli airstrike in Lebanon killed at least 10 people including a Hezbollah commander, violating a ceasefire with zero international pushback. A bill allowing the execution of Palestinian prisoners is advancing through the Israeli Knesset, enabled by years of international indifference. A senior Saudi figure publicly accused the UAE of being Israel's Trojan horse in the Gulf, signaling a fracture in Gulf unity. 2 Pakistani soldiers were killed in a militant attack in the northwest, a reminder that the wars nobody talks about keep claiming lives. And the threat of a US-Iran conflict looms over the entire region.
These stories are connected. They are connected by the threat of unchecked power, by the failure of international institutions, by the human cost of conflicts that serve the interests of the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And they will remain connected tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until something changes.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed. Stay critical. And we'll see you next time.
Good night.